If you think World War I was won only with weapons, you're wrong. One of the biggest actors in this war was money. And maybe its deadliest weapon wasn't artillery, rifles, or poison gas. It was debt. Because in 1914, governments didn't just send soldiers to the front, they also pushed their own people, without them even realizing it, into a massive financial war. When we think of World War I, the same images usually come to mind: trenches, the sound of artillery, soldiers, destroyed cities. But there was another side of the war, one that happened far away from the battlefield. A war fought inside banks, bond markets, government offices, and the closed rooms of financiers. And the decisions made there didn't just determine who would win and who would lose. They helped build the global economic system we still live in today. Because World War I taught governments something very dangerous: that they could suspend gold, that they could print money, that they could sell debt to their own people, that they could borrow from abroad, and years later they could make ordinary people pay the bill for all of it. So maybe it's time to rethink the idea that wars are won only by armies and politicians. Before we begin this story, I want to ask you one question. Who really wins wars? The soldiers fighting on the front lines, or the people controlling the money behind those armies? Write your answer in the comments, because the story I'm about to tell you shows that wars are not only fought with soldiers. They are fought with debt, banks, and trust. World War I proved that money could be used as a weapon, and not just any weapon, one of the most powerful weapons ever created. In 1914, Europe was already a powder keg waiting to explode. Empires distrusted each other, colonial ambitions were rising, and alliances had turned the continent into a giant chessboard. Everyone talked about honor, homeland, and empire. But beneath all those grand speeches, there was a much simpler truth. A war this large was unbelievably expensive. There were millions of soldiers to feed. Weapons had to be produced. Ships, trains, bullets, uniforms, hospitals, logistics. Everything had to be paid for. War wasn't only consuming human lives, it was burning through money. And the painful part was this: the moment leaders chose war, they also chose debt. With every soldier sent to the front, an invisible debt was written onto the future of ordinary people. And when the war began, almost everyone believed it would be short. "They'll be home by Christmas," people said. They thought a little gold would be used, some money would be borrowed, and the public would support the war out of patriotism. But the war began swallowing money faster than anyone expected, and the old financial order couldn't keep up. Now let's get to the heart of it. In the summer of 1914, Europe's monetary system was still largely tied to something called the gold standard. Think of it like this: the paper money in your hand wasn't really valuable by itself. It was a promise. The government was saying, "Bring me this paper, and I will give you real gold in return." That was the trust behind money. People trusted money because they believed there was gold behind it. But this system had one serious limit. Gold was not unlimited. A government could not print money forever, because every piece of paper was supposed to carry some kind of confidence in gold. In normal times, this system created stability. But war is not normal. When millions of people were sent to the front, and factories began producing weapons day and night, war costs became uncontrollable. Germany was spending millions of marks a day. Britain's war costs would soon rise to millions of pounds a day as well. And here, the math was brutal. Gold could not keep up, so governments broke the rule. One by one, the great powers suspended the gold standard. They presented this to the public as a technical decision. But what they were really doing was much bigger. They were quietly telling their citizens, "Your money is no longer tied to gold the way it used to be. From now on, what holds it up is your trust in us." That moment was one of the most important turning points in modern economic history, because money began to separate from metal. Power was no longer stored only in gold reserves. It was now in printing presses, credit, bond markets, and the ability to convince the public. And once governments tasted that freedom, there was no easy way back. The financial war was now truly beginning. Germany's situation was especially difficult. It was largely cut off from global capital markets. Sea routes were controlled by the British Navy. Finding money from abroad was difficult. So Germany was left with one major option: borrow from its own people. Berlin launched massive war bond campaigns. The message was simple: put your savings into war loans, support your country. When victory comes, you will get your money back. Posters were printed. Newspapers pushed the message. Families were called to sacrifice. Buying war bonds was not presented as just a financial decision. It was presented as a patriotic duty. People gave their savings to the state because they believed in the state, because they believed victory was coming, because they believed their money would return. But this system was a giant pyramid built on hope. When Germany lost, those bonds lost their meaning. Millions of people watched the money they had saved for years lose its value. This was not just an economic loss, it was a collapse of trust. And that collapse helped prepare the ground for much darker political movements in Germany later on. Economic history does not always reveal itself immediately. Sometimes it stores anger for years. Then one day it comes back in a much more dangerous form. Britain held a different set of cards. Before the war, London was one of the financial centers of the world. Sterling was strong. Britain's financial network stretched across the globe. At first, Britain also tried to finance the war with treasury bills, short-term borrowing, and patriotic appeals. But as the war dragged on, it had to turn to a much deeper source: the United States of America. In 1914, America was officially outside the war. But American bankers were not outside the war. Because while Europe was burning, Wall Street saw a massive opportunity. Financial institutions like J.P. Morgan became vital to Britain and France. They arranged loans. They organized purchases of weapons, food, and raw materials. A major part of the money needed to keep the Allied war machine running began coming from the other side of the Atlantic. By the time America officially entered the war in 1917, Wall Street had already been financing the Allied war effort for years. This was not charity. This was power. American bankers made enormous profits from the process. But more importantly, America's position in the world economy changed completely. Before the war, America was largely a debtor nation. After the war, it became one of the world's greatest creditors. If you've ever wondered why the 20th century became known as the American century, the answer is not only found on the battlefield, it is hidden in the accounting books. America's global rise did not begin with military power alone. It began when America started controlling the flow of money. France was trapped in a similar situation. It was spending enormous resources to defend its borders. It had to borrow from its own people and from abroad. The French people were known for their habit of saving, so buying government bonds seemed reasonable to many of them. But as the war continued, France also became increasingly dependent on American capital. And that dependence did not disappear when the war ended. Instead, debts and repayment disputes became one of the greatest sources of tension in post-war politics. Because when a war is financed with debt, the problem does not end when the war ends. It only changes form. The war on the front ends. But the war inside the accounting books begins. In Russia, the situation was far more destructive. The empire was huge, but economically fragile. Its industry was weak. Its banking system was not strong. To finance the war, Russia borrowed heavily from its allies, especially France. But as defeats piled up, the monetary system began to crack. Inflation rose. Trust in the ruble weakened. The purchasing power of ordinary people collapsed. And by 1917, Russia was not only a military wreck, it was an economic wreck. It would be incomplete to explain the fall of the Tsarist regime only through ideas, revolutionary slogans, or bad generals. Sometimes revolutions do not begin in the streets, they begin inside the currency. When a people lose trust in their money, their state, and their future, the political order begins to shake with it. That is what happened in Russia. Once again, money and power were walking on the same page of history. Now let's step back and look at the whole picture. By the end of the war, the world had not only lost millions of lives, it had also lost the old monetary order. The gold standard had been shattered. Inflation had torn through many economies. States were buried under one of the largest debt loads the world had ever seen. And who paid the bill? Most often, workers, small savers, salaried employees, ordinary people who had trusted the government and bought war bonds. The wealthy, on the other hand, often found ways to protect themselves. They moved money abroad. They bought gold. They bought land. They bought real assets. They stayed close to the places where information arrived first. The lesson was painful, but clear. In a financial war, the first people to bleed are often ordinary citizens. And this is where the connection to today becomes important. World War I was the moment governments learned that they could separate money from reality and still finance the almost impossible. They saw that they could suspend gold. They saw that they could print money. They saw that they could sell debt to their own people. They saw that they could borrow enormous sums from abroad. And then they saw that all of the wreckage could be covered with propaganda, restructuring, and new debt. Does that sound familiar? Because this game was never completely abandoned. From the Great Depression to the financial crisis of 2008, from the inflation of the 1970s to modern debt crises, you can hear the echo of 1914 again and again. When governments and central banks say, this is temporary, when they say, the fundamentals are strong, when they say, don't worry, everything is under control. Remember that people in 1914 believed similar words too, until the value of their money began to melt away. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the battlefield was not only in the trenches. There was another battlefield in the accounting books. America, once a debtor nation, had become one of the strongest creditors in the world. Europe was drowning in debt. Britain owed billions to America. France owed billions as well. Smaller countries were trapped in debts they could never realistically repay. The war had turned Wall Street into the new financial center of the planet. The weight London had carried for centuries was now shifting toward America. What no cannon could achieve alone, debt and credit had achieved. The age of American dominance in money and power began this way, but this transition was not as smooth as it looked. Because when wars are financed with debt, repayment becomes a war of its own. Britain and France had promises to keep to their own citizens. People who had bought war bonds had to be paid. But to pay them, they needed money. And they wanted that money from Germany through reparations. The Treaty of Versailles placed an almost impossible burden on Germany. 132 billion gold marks. The goal was punishment, to push the cost of the war onto the defeated country. But it was also an economic fantasy, because Germany could not truly pay it. If it tried to pay by printing money, the problem grew. If it tried to pay with goods, the economy tightened even more. Every solution cracked the system a little further. The hyperinflation Germany experienced in 1923 was not an accident. It was the result of an economy trapped by debts it could not pay. Images of people carrying worthless banknotes just to buy bread were not just signs of economic disaster. They were signs of a society losing trust. And that collapse fed the anger that extremist movements would later use. America, meanwhile, was in a different position. It had gold. It had credit. Its banks had grown stronger, but now it was pumping money back into Europe. Loans were given to Germany. Germany used that money to pay reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France then used that money to repay their debts to America. On the surface, the system looked like it was working, but in reality, it was a wheel chasing its own tail. Money was not creating new value. It was just moving from one hand to another. The Dawes Plan and the Young Plan tried to organize this cycle, but the structure was already fragile, and when the Great Depression arrived, the entire financial balance collapsed. The world had never been so connected, and maybe it had never been so fragile. That is why World War I is not just a chapter in military history. It is a turning point in economic history. This war showed that governments could abandon gold, that they could weaken money, that they could borrow on a scale never seen before, and that they could present all of it to the public as doing what had to be done. Propaganda turned debt into patriotism. Ordinary people handed their savings to the state for bonds they believed would be repaid. But the real winners of war were often not the men fighting in the trenches. They were the men sitting at the table. Money and power had never been so tightly connected, and the world has been living with the consequences ever since. Now connect this to your own life. When central banks say inflation is temporary, when governments raise the debt ceiling again, when new money is created digitally with the press of a button, remember 1914. Remember that the gold standard was not suspended by accident. It was suspended by choice in a moment of desperation. Remember that borrowing from the future, printing money to save the present, and selling debt to the public through patriotic language is a game more than a century old. The excuses change, the language changes, the names of the crises change, but the bill is often sent to the same people: ordinary savers, salaried workers, the middle class, small investors. The hidden financial war behind World War I is not just a story from the past. It is one of the foundations of the world we live in today. The lesson is harsh but real. When money separates from reality, it stops being just a medium of exchange. It becomes a tool of manipulation. Governments will always find a way to finance wars, bailouts, and crises, but the cost is often passed on to you. Sometimes through taxes, sometimes through inflation, and sometimes through the quiet erosion of your savings. Real wealth is not just a number on a screen. It is not a promise made by a politician. Real wealth is knowledge, resilience, and the ability to see behind illusions. Because history does not repeat exactly, but it often rhymes. The financial game written in 1914 was played again and again throughout the next century, each time with a new language, a new crisis, a new excuse. But the result was often the same. Those in power protected themselves. Those who did not understand the system paid the price. If you take only one thing from this story, let it be this: do not believe a piece of paper has real value just because a number is printed on it. Do not judge the strength of a system only by the words of the people in charge, because the truth is often not hidden in slogans. It is hidden in the accounting books, and history always reminds you where to look. If this video gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe. History is filled with answers waiting to be discovered. I'll show you where to start looking.